This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences.
My first time? My first time is a story of the time that wasn't.
Welcome to Sexual Encounters, the very first time. The podcast where we talk about first times, the good, the awkward, and everything in between. I'm your host, Mary Jane. Today, we're exploring first LGBTQ plus sexual experiences. Because coming out is one journey. Navigating intimacy as a queer person is another, filled with its own mix of challenges, joy, fear, and freedom. In this episode, we're centering queer voices for those who are out and ready, to those still figuring things out along the way. In the previous episodes of this podcast, we've talked a lot about how first times come with expectations. And for queer people, those expectations can carry even more weight. We're told that sex is supposed to look a certain way or follow a certain order. After coming out, in a safe partnership, once you fully know yourself. But the reality is usually more complex. So let's take a moment to unpack some of the myths around queer first times. So joining us today to unpack these myths and offer insights is Dr. Ellen Mallory, an assistant professor at The Ohio State University, whose research focuses on health and well-being of LGBTQ plus individuals, especially how stigma, relationships, and culture shape queer experiences, including sexuality and intimacy. Welcome to the show, Dr. Mallory. I'm so excited to have you join the conversation today.
Yes, thank you, Mary Jane. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Let's start with this first myth. You need to be fully out and confident before having your first queer experience. It's an idea that shows up a lot in media, in conversations with peers, and sometimes even within queer spaces. Dr. Mallory, what are your thoughts on this? And how does this belief impact the way people approach or delay their first experiences? And is there a healthier way we can think about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this is such an important myth to challenge because a lot of times we're just figuring things out as we go. And so I think the expectation that we have to be fully confident and fully out before having your first queer sexual experiences is kind of a tall order. A lot of times people explore their sexuality, they're trying to figure out like what feels most authentic to them and how exactly it is like they want to like experience and enact their sexuality. Because as we know, like there's lots of different ways to do queer sex. Like there's lots of fun ways to to get into lots of different fun situations, fun interactions, and it takes time to figure that out. And so I think in terms of thinking about it from a healthier angle, I think it's better to think about having your first queer sexual experience when it feels like you're ready, feeling like you're with somebody that you feel comfortable with, at least safe with, or at least in a comfortable and safe environment. And if you feel like you're ready to explore that, go for it. Sex is awkward. can be awkward and like all kinds of things happen. So your first time, it could be incredibly amazing, life-changing, memorable. It could also be very awkward and not at all what you expected. And so I think at the end of the day, what is important is that you feel good about the person or people that you're having this experience with and feel comfortable and safe.
So here's another one. And this one comes up a lot, especially in sex positive spaces, that
Mhm.
queer sex should always be joyful and affirming. There can be a lot of pressure around first queer experiences that they should feel empowering or celebratory or somehow right for the first time. What are your thoughts on this expectation and how might it affect someone's experience, especially as you said, if the first time is awkward and doesn't match the ideal?
There is sort of this additional stress we put on ourselves that sex is always going to be this positive, affirming, joyful, amazing experience. And I hope it is for everybody. I hope that like you get to have those experiences. Of course, we want to have joyful and affirming sex, but the reality is, yeah, sex can be awkward. Sometimes it can be scary if there's something you've never tried before and you're open to trying it, but you've never done it before. It's normal to be a little scared about it. A lot of times we're navigating kind of what two people are interested in doing. And so like the communication around that can be awkward. The actual experience of like trying to get bodies aligned in the right way, or like if you're using toys or anything like that, like it takes practice. And so even if sex isn't hopefully it's not a negative experience. Like ideally we can if through communication and engaging with partners that you're able to feel safe with, you're able to kind of have these experiences that at worst they're just awkward. They're not like bad. They're just awkward or maybe they're just fine. Like it's not you're not having mind-blowing orgasms. It's just like it was fun and you had a good time, but it wasn't you're like you might not be interested in doing that again with another person, or maybe you tried something you didn't like it. But there's definitely that middle ground of where sex is just sometimes it just is what it is. It's not necessarily this super amazing experience every time you have sex, but I guess that's what we strive for, but that's not the everyday experience of sex.
Indeed. And sometimes also, I suppose, the pressure from the conversations we have with friends. A lot of times people will only talk about the exciting aspect of it. And then you feel like,
Mhm.
is mine not going well or something, right?
Yes, we do always leave out the awkward parts.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so then there's this persistent myth that you're not really queer until you've had sex. This one
Mhm.
shows up both in mainstream narratives and sometimes even within the LGBTQ plus communities, as if sexual experiences somehow validates identity. How do you see
Mhm.
this myth impacting people, particularly those who are questioning, or those who are celibate by choice, or those who simply haven't had that first experience yet? And how can we shift away from that kind of thinking?
Yeah, this is so important. And for so many reasons, I think a lot of these myths honestly have made me think about the term of like kind of homonormativity of this idea that there's like a right way to be queer. And in reality, a lot of us know there's lots of ways to think about it. A lot of us know that we're queer long before we have sex, either through our own explorations that maybe don't result in sex, which brings me back to another thing. It's like, what do we even consider sex and what does that mean to have sex when you're queer? Because there's just so many different ways that you're gonna have sex in the first place. But in general, a lot of us come to this idea that we might be queer in some way without having those experiences. And that doesn't mean that you can't be in community with other people that have share those identities with you. It doesn't mean that you can't date people if that share those identities. Maybe you could potentially be somewhere on like the A spectrum or demisexual or something, and that's just not part of what you're seeking right away. And it doesn't take away from the fact that you've come to your own understanding of your identity as queer. I think it's much more helpful. And the other thing I think about that too is like in terms of sexual fluidity, we're always exploring and learning and kind of deepening our own understanding of our sexual identity, our who we are as sexual beings. And so the idea that you have to wait until you have sex to know that an identity is what fits with you is very limiting, and a lot of times it doesn't, even if you there are people that have had queer sex and don't identify as queer too. And so I think we should focus a lot more on you identify with what feels right for you and you have the experiences that you want to have, and if those align, great. But at the end of the day, I think we should more focus on finding what feels authentic to us and our identity and in our sexual experiences.
I'd love to zoom out a
Mhm.
bit and talk about some of the broader challenges of LGBTQ plus individuals, the challenges that they face when they're navigating first time experiences. What are some of the
Mhm.
unique challenges that come out, both around the experience itself, of course, but also the emotional readiness that may shape whether a person is out or still questioning their identity? What's your perspective on this?
I think one is just things are much better now than they were. Even I'm not that old, but even when I was younger, things are substantially better in terms of just there being more diversity of narratives of like, what does that first time even look like? But I think there's still a lack of that. And so I think just coming into it, a lot of times the way that we kind of prepare ourselves and thinking about what our first sexual experience will look like is it comes from what we see in media, it comes from conversations with friends, what we hear from family, maybe conversations with family. And there's just not as many of those narratives to like base our experiences on. That's one big challenge. Another one I think is just that LGBTQ, queer are very big umbrella terms. And so even within any particular identity that we want to focus on, what people are interested is varies a lot. One example, I was recently at a sex therapy conference, and I'm forgetting his name now, but met a clinician who coined the term side. So for gay men, a lot of times it doesn't have to be specific to gay men, but in this context, we were talking about gay men, and typically people are like a top or a bottom or maybe a verse. And for a long time excluded this idea of like gay men who are sides and have like no interest in penetration, but like to do all the other things. If you're coming into a first sexual experience, maybe you've had a conversation about this, but sometimes you haven't. And it's just like you're just figuring out what is the way that you like to have sex within like maybe a particular role or role that you've taken on or fits for you. I think is a pretty unique challenge that when I think about people that are heterosexual having sex, there's like more of a normative script of like what that's supposed to look like. There can be a lot of variation, but I think when it comes to queer experiences, you also have to think about gender plays a pretty important role. Like what kind of body is in front of you that and what do they like or not like, and that can be tied to identity in a way that I think is pretty unique. And then the last one's just overall stigma. We all at some level internalize kind of negative messages about what it means to be queer. And especially if it's your first time, your first experience, that could be following you into this first experience. I was going to say bedroom, but it could be wherever you're having it. It could be following you into that, and it that can be challenging because you might leading up to, during, after might have some negative feelings about what happened, or even just be thinking a lot about what does it mean to have had this experience. And I think although there is definitely still in general a lot of stigma and shame around sex broadly, I think there is a unique stigma that queer people face when it comes to sex.
And then another layer I'd love your perspective on is the cultural message around queer sex. What kinds of narratives do you think impact LGBTQ plus folks in how they approach first times? And how might those expectations create, as you were saying, shame, the stigma around it, or unrealistic ideas about what the experience should be?
That's a very good question. I think a lot of the cultural narratives, the ones that come to mind for me are the ones that talking about the earlier myth that it's going to be this life-changing kind of like amazing experience. And yeah, sometimes that's the case and sometimes it's not. I think there are also cultural narratives about like what role you should or shouldn't be and what that means or doesn't mean when it comes to sex. And if you're bringing those into the bedroom, you might be engaging in more performative sex than enjoying and relaxing into just enjoying and having a more authentic experience. And I think a lot of times the best way to cut through those cultural narratives is to have the conversation about it. The setting, depending on how you're having your first experience, that might not always be at the forefront, having like clear communication about what is or isn't going to happen. But really, that's the only way to cut through those narratives is really just to have that conversation about like what are we going to do here? What are we interested in having happen for this first time? And I say that knowing that sometimes that can be challenging when it's your first time, which I think is a larger negative culture narrative about like not communicating during sex. That's the other thing about a lot of these stories is people having sex and there's like no communication, everything just flows smoothly in the way that everybody seems okay with, and there's not a lot of communication about it. And I think that that's kind of the limiting thing is not talking about things is what can often lead to sex being awkward.
Yeah, the communication is the tough part.
Mm,
I mean,
yes, yeah.
I grew up in a very patriarchal society where the women are encouraged to be shy around sexual related conversation. So it's very
Mhm,
difficult to even spark that conversation with a partner to say, well,
mhm.
how are we going to approach this? How are we going to do this?
Right.
But yeah. So, for any queer listener or listeners who are either preparing for the first time or maybe processing an experience that didn't go well,
Mhm.
what advice would you offer and how can they approach this part of the journey with more self-compassion and a clearer sense of what really matters?
For the queer listeners that are preparing for a first experience, I think for yourself, something that you can do is like you can only control the things that you can control starting out. And so I think kind of mentally preparing yourself for the fact that like things could go awry, things could happen that you don't expect. And going into the experience, just looking to enjoy whatever you have planned this other person or people. I think thinking about contraception if as needed, not really barriers more often. I guess it could be contraception or barriers, depending on the bodies that are involved in terms of how you want to protect yourself when you're engaging in when you're preparing to engage in the sex and like and being confident about your decision about what you want that to look like can also be pretty important in terms of feeling confident going into the situation. And of course, going back to communication, sometimes having conversations with this person can also be a form of foreplay and just talking about what you are excited to try or have happen or not have happen could be a fun way to kind of like start to stoke the fire for the experience and having that conversation. I think for people that have had maybe a negative experience and are processing it, my advice varies there. It depends on the reason behind the negative experience. I think if you've had a negative experience because there was something that happened non-consensually, I think that that's a different conversation, and I think it's important to one understand that like what happened wasn't your fault. If you have friends, community that you feel comfortable talking to about the experience to get support, that's always an option. A lot of times having those experiences, people process it and react to it in different ways. And so understanding that what happened wasn't something that was your fault or something you could send it to, and just being understanding that you might be having a lot of different reactions to it is one thing that can help. And then as you feel comfortable and feel like you're ready to seeking support to talk about those experiences with someone that you either feel comfortable talking to or a professional that can help you work through the experience is important. For negative experiences that are maybe they were consensual, but like things just didn't go the way that you wanted them to go. For those experiences, I think it can be helpful to just kind of process it and take it as a lesson of like this thing happened and like I was on board with it, but I don't think I want to do that again. Or if it's maybe an experience you had with somebody that you have an ongoing dynamic with, you can have a conversation about it with them and say, this thing happened while when we were engaging in sex, and I think these are ways that it could be better. These are things that I didn't like about it. Maybe we can try this differently next time. A lot of times, some advice is the instead of focusing on the fact that you didn't like something, unless you just really like, I don't ever want to do that again. Where you can focus on reframe it as that I really liked when we did this, and I think these are some ways that we can make it better next time, so it's a better experience. So I think in terms of like processing negative experiences, I think those are my thoughts right now.
Thank you very much for sharing, Dr. Mallory. Your insights are very helpful, and it's such an important conversation to have. And I hope that, people will be encouraged to communicate more and be kinder to themselves about their first time experiences. And of course, again, communication, communication, communication.
Yes, yes, it's
Yeah.
so important.
Well, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed the conversation.
As Dr. Mallory mentioned, first sexual experiences, especially for queer folks, don't always come with a clear roadmap. Sometimes there's no conversation about what's going to happen, and you're still figuring things out as you go. In today's listener story, the storyteller shares just that, and how his first time wasn't just one moment, but a journey that unfolded over several years. Take a listen.
My first time? My first time is a story of the time that wasn't. I was 17 attending an international boarding school in what was then the Kingdom of Swaziland. It was my 6th year at the school. In my first year, my classmates noticed a womanly sway to my hips and a higher pitch to my voice. My mannerisms did very little to hide the homosexual tendencies that lay beneath. Nonetheless, I spent years defending myself against the "you're gay" accusations, desperately acting out what I thought they thought manhood was supposed to look like. But I was not alone. Through those 6 years, there were other boys that moved the way I did and spoke with the same betraying voice. In the first few years, I avoided such boys. The association would only strengthen the public case against my heterosexuality. But in the shadows, in the whispers, and at night, I would concoct complex stratagem to hunt and capture the affections of men. So after 6 years of having stolen handjobs and kisses from mostly straight boys, a beautiful foreign man came to my school. Julian. Even though he came from another continent and had a girlfriend for a term, his voice and his walk gave away a secret. I have grown up to learn that the voice and walk indicate absolutely nothing. A man is only what a man says he is. But at the time, in Eswatini, men hunting men had nothing but superstition and intuition to go on. No one was allowed to say they were gay. In Swaziland, being gay is illegal. My attraction to men was clouded not just by Christian guilt, but also political danger. Engaging the gay question could be met with simple rejection, complete social exclusion, actual physical violence, and even state-sanctioned imprisonment. So when I began my seduction of Julian, it had to be in secret. We would flirt in the common room, exchange glances at lunch, and buy each other drinks at parties. After weeks of caressing shoulders, he invited me to his room for a movie. That Friday, after they locked the boarding house doors, I excitedly waited in my room for the other boys to go to sleep before I snuck my way to Julian's bed. He had cleaned up and turned his tiny cubicle into a makeshift cinema. We sat side by side watching Amélie on a laptop in the dark. His hand reached for my thigh and rested there. I was scared. I didn't fully know what to do. Piano music and French dialogue was humming in the background. I stared at the laptop, but my mind was squarely on him. He spoke to me about how Marxist theory influenced the creation of the film. I later learned it was all nonsense. But I turned to hear him. I looked intently into his eyes, as he did into mine. A messy make-out session ensued. We ripped our pants off and threw away our shirts. Then, for the first time, I set to go down on a man. He reached for a condom, and because he was foreign, this act suggested to me he didn't want to be infected by the dirty African, but he was just being overly cautious. Because he wasn't black, I wondered if this blowjob was some act of racial subjugation, but I was too horny to let racial justice stop me from getting that dick. I did what I saw in pornos. What you don't see in pornos is what happens inside the mouth. No teeth, he said. What? Where am I supposed to put my teeth? What they don't tell you is that an erect penis in your mouth is like a massive adult pacifier, firm yet malleable. All I wanted to do was nibble on his. But I couldn't. I really enjoyed giving him head. I felt wanted. He maneuvered me off his penis and turned me around. He was gearing to penetrate me. I panicked. I quickly put a stop to that. I had no idea how one prevents a mess, let alone if it would hurt. Nobody taught me what I was supposed to do ahead of time, and I was not about to start painting on this boy's bed. We instead had sex between the thighs. Frottage. making out and simulating penetration. We lay afterwards and negotiated the terms of our high school romance. It was a magical night. We became a secret couple, but only on weekends. Every Sunday I would break up with him because I thought it was unchristian to be in a gay relationship. Then on Fridays, I would sneak back into his room and become his boyfriend all over again. While it was a positive experience, it was confusing. A fantasy shrouded in lust, shame, and secrecy with a side of faith-based existential crisis. Mary, you talk about first times. This was my first time. Although there was no penetration, I lost what was left of my sexual virtue that night. And to this day, I count my sexual partners as those that reach or cross the boundary of oral sex. It wasn't one night. My loss of virginity was a continuous erosion of innocence over 6 years, from first kiss to fondling to handjob and now blowjob. I'm happy it happened this way because now at my big age, I still love blowjobs.
Hearing our listener's story and Dr. Mallory's insights really reminds me just how layered and personal first times can be, especially for those of us navigating identity, coming out, and intimacy all at once. First times, no matter your identity, are as diverse as the people having them. There's no right way, no single path, no shame if your experience didn't look the way that you thought it would. Your identity is valid. Your story is valid. And your first time, whether it was joyful, awkward, complicated, or all of the above, matters. And as always, if you'd like to share your first time story, or if today's conversation sparked something you'd like to reflect on, would love to hear from you. You can submit your story anonymously at bit.ly/Let's Talk First, or you can DM us at Let's Talk First. Next time on Sexual Encounters, the very first time, we're talking about consent and communication during first time encounters, because knowing how to say yes and how to hear no is just as important as anything else. Don't miss it. You're listening to Sexual Encounters, the very first time.